Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning or this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are in the world, for our final keynote presentation of the Eli Conference, which we're very excited to have Matt Sigelman from the Burning Glass Institute. Matt, over to you.
Grace, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for the chance to share this time together. When it comes to the kinds of transformations that we expect in the world of AI and education, so much of the conversation that we have today is focused on the how of AI. How will we use it in the classroom? How will we personalize learning? How will we keep kids from cheating? So little of the conversation is on the what. What is it that students need to learn? What skills will prepare them for the future? What needs to change in our curriculum? A lot of the reason why we haven't done that is because we haven't seen the kind of data that we need in order to understand what those changes will look like. But still, imagine you were at the dawn of the computer era and had the chance to actually rethink what it is that we teach. That's the opportunity that we have today. And so I'm looking forward to sharing with you a little bit about what we're seeing already changing, looking as well at what our models are showing will change and the implications for how this reshapes the landscape of opportunity for learners and workers over time. I'm a data guy. I'm going to share with you a lot of data. For those of you not familiar, the Burning Glass Institute is a nonprofit data laboratory that pulls together data from lots of different sources in order to be able to understand how, at the intersection of work and learning, how people move up and how we improve outcomes for learners and workers. So the data that we look at are in a lot of cases very empirical. The things that we can see by how jobs are changing in real time, how people's careers are already starting to change. And let me share with you with that in mind, perhaps one of the most important things I want to get across in our time together is the importance of looking beyond the level of jobs. We tend to get very fixated on the breathless headlines about how many jobs are going to be born, how many jobs are going away, and instead at how the nature of work is already changing and has been changing well before generative AI came on the scene. From a study that the Burning Glass Institute and the Boston Consulting Group did together a couple of years ago, right before the dawn of generative AI, we looked at essentially what people often call the half-life of skills. We looked at how much the skills required to do a job change over time. We found that the average occupation had seen 37% of its skills change in just the prior 5 years. Think about whether 37% of your curriculum changed over the course of 5 years. In fact, in many places, that would run afoul of accreditation guidelines if you did. More importantly, this isn't just that, hey, there's a lot of skills changing and that may be because tech stacks change. What we often saw was a more profound set of changes. And this is what you see on the right. We found is that far from this just being about tech stacks changing, in a lot of ways, skills were blending across domains. Take the example of an accountant on the one side and a data scientist on the other side, and think about skills forming the DNA of their work. And what you could see is that the skills to be an accountant, this is what my kids would call the no-duck question, right, are accounting skills. But increasingly what we're seeing is jobs like data scientists, which are blending skills from across domains. Yes, data skills taught in the math faculty, but also you're seeing a lot of computer science skills because data scientists are developing models, and business skills because data scientists aren't just running numbers, they're answering business problems. And those, of course, are taught in the computer science and business faculties. And so these kinds of changes often challenge the way that we prepare students. What makes this even more complex is that as we start to see emerging technologies disrupt work, this isn't just cut and paste. We're tempted to say, okay, well, there's a new skill. We just need to make sure that we add it to the curriculum. But in many cases, emerging skills completely redefine a job. Take the example of an actuary. Actuaries are as we probably know, are running computational math at scale. Um, Strangely, relatively few actuaries use machine learning. Those who do, um, and it's strange because, of course, machine learning is a way of doing computational math at much greater scale. But when actuaries start using ML, the whole rest of their job changes. Instead of focusing on things like risk management and finance and actuarial science and using old software packages like SAS, they start using machine learning and data science, advanced analytics R. They get more involved in auditing. The kinds of things they used to be doing are getting automated away. And as a result, there's a whole new set of skills that they wind up taking on. That says that these transformations may require us to rethink what we're teaching altogether. It also starts to create a template for the kinds of changes that we're seeing in generative AI. So let me share with you a little bit about what we can already see. We all know that there's no shortage of prognostication when it comes to generative AI. People predicting big firestorms that are going to lead to mass unemployment, um, or the happy futurists who have sunny projections of job growth. The reality is that we can already see changes going on in generative AI. And again, not so much because we're seeing big changes in demand for different kinds of occupations, but because the composition of jobs, how jobs are getting defined, is itself changing in much more subtle ways. Take this, for example. One of the things that we've seen is that of the kinds of skills in any given job that most overlap AI, we've seen just in the last almost 3 years now since LLMs first hit the public market, we've seen about a 16% decline in demand for those skills that are most readily automated, and correspondingly about an 8% increase in demand for the skills that are most readily augmented through AI. So we can already start to see some of these changes, even though job tallies have yet to actually significantly change. I also want to think about that model of that we learned a minute ago from actuaries. I want to go back to that because it plays out more broadly across the market. What we're seeing here is that the kinds of jobs that are most readily automated, that have the most automation effects going on inside them, are also the kinds of jobs where the greatest levels of augmentation are happening. Remember how we said that with the actuaries, once they stopped having to do a lot of the computational processes that were consuming most of their time, they wound up filling that time with other higher value tasks. Nature abhors a vacuum, and as tasks get automated away, in many cases, though certainly not all, we start to see that time get filled up with new kinds of tasks, new sets of skills that come to be leveraged. In fact, one of the things that we found is that the kinds of effects that I just described, this interplay of automation and augmentation, actually bears out even with specific skills. That was something we thought was kind of weird. So let me explain what that looks like. This is an example. This is a set of analysis that we did to try to understand which skills are most likely to get automated away. That is to say, overlap the most with the capabilities of AI, and which ones are most likely to be augmented by AI, to be improved by AI, but not replaced. And we built a bunch of statistical models. I won't bore you with all the details of what they look like. We press go. And you know what we found? We found, for the most part, the same, maybe not for the most part, but we found in many cases at least, the same sets of skills on each list. So think about that. What that says is that there's a set of skills that we're saying are automated away, and there's often the same set of skills that we say are being augmented. And first time we looked at that, we said, okay, well, we clearly got this wrong. When we dug into it, we found in fact, there are sets of skills that make us both more efficient and more effective at the same time. those become force multipliers to human work. And they become essentially the new power skills of the AI era. In many cases, those are skills that we're used to thinking about as big AI capabilities, things like writing or problem solving or like things that you could theoretically you could give to AI tasks and have it replace you. But in many cases, when we start to have a broader definition of what those functions represent, we come to realize that AI doesn't replace us so much as it makes us both more efficient and more effective at the same time. These become, again, power skills, and every student is going to need to learn them. On similar note, I want to put a stake in the heart, if I could, of the argument that we keep hearing about how no one's going to need to code anymore because we've got generative AI to do coding for us. I want you to think back to Microsoft Excel. Um, you know, back when Microsoft Excel first came on the market, it was designed to um, essentially automate away a lot of ledger math functions and make it a more streamlined process. Well, here's what happened. Think about the way that you use data in your day job and all the ways that so many people do data analysis today. And think about how much of that would have been readily feasible before Microsoft Excel, or I guess Lotus 123 before it, or Google Sheets since. The reality is that Microsoft Excel put data analysis in the hands of a lot more people. In a lot, much the same way, the fact that AI can write code, that it can generate images, that it can do data analysis, doesn't replace us. Rather, it says that these are going to be core functions that many more of us are going to need to use. It democratizes capabilities, and that means that while we may or may not need fewer coders, more of us, not fewer, will need to know how to code. At the same time, what this says is that we're finding that more and more people, more and more jobs, and this again is what we're seeing already observing empirically, are becoming more specialized. That is to say, that many of the general functions in a job are starting to very slowly, but very markedly go away and leave people more focused on the things that are more specific and higher value. That's important because it also speaks to the way that people move from job to job. What you're seeing on the left is not a Jackson Pollock, but rather a cluster map. Jobs tend to travel together like pack animals based on the skills that they have in common. So the colors that you see in the first chart at the top on the left are represent different career areas. Let's say orange might be engineering jobs, and the red or purple ones to the left of it may be healthcare jobs or the like, and you get the point. But what we start to see is this, as each job gets new skills, as the skills are in some cases specialized, as they absorb more cross-functional skills, what you're seeing is that the correspondences between jobs change. New transitions become possible, old transitions become less feasible. And what that says is that we need to think more about the skills that enable people to enter into work and to move through work over time. We're already, again, seeing this bear out. We're seeing, on the one hand, a decline in web developers becoming software developers. On the other hand, we're seeing as marketing managers become more and more about manipulating customer data, we're seeing them have more correspondence to data scientists and a greater prevalence of people actually making that transition. And so we're going to see a lot more of this. And this is something we need to keep track of because it's going to have significant implication for our students. I want to also talk for a minute about how AI shapes learning curves. My colleagues, Joe Fuller and Mike Fenlon at Harvard, and I have been studying the impact of AI on learning curves. That seems kind of abstruse, but let me tell you why it's important. Every job has a learning curve in it, and those curves are of different shapes. You can actually proxy for them fairly well by looking not at learning curves, but at earning curves. How much people make and how that changes over time, because it's a reflection of how your productivity increases and how that corresponds with the development of skill. In a lot of jobs, there's a fair amount of skill it takes to get into the job, but over time, your trajectory tends to be pretty flat. Take the example of a bus driver. If you've been on the job for 3 weeks or for 30 years, your job is show up on time, don't crash the bus. There's not a lot of scope for productivity improvement. Compare that with we were talking before about data scientists or software developers, where there's a huge difference between somebody at the entry level and somebody who's really an expert. And so what we could do is then say, okay, let's look at the sets of jobs where and look at those learning curves and be able to distinguish based on the nature of where ABI plays out. We find in the jobs which have big upfront learning curves, but then flatten productivity over time. In those kinds of jobs, their AI actually can open up more opportunity at the entry level because it brings down knowledge requirements. It makes those knowledge sets that used to be specialized now accessible to a broader array of people just as they're starting out. On the other hand, in many of the kinds of jobs, and especially the kinds of jobs that tend to require a university degree, the kinds of jobs that many of us have had that we aspire to for our students. In those kinds of jobs, what we find is that actually, when you look at the skills at the entry level and the skills for experienced workers, the skills at the entry level are much more likely to be overlapping AI. Think of it this way. When students in those kinds of jobs first get hired, what they're getting hired for is their capacity rather than specific capabilities. They get introduced into the work through some fairly humble tasks. Over time, they get good at those tasks. They get given more complex tasks. They develop intuition. Eventually, they get good. It's a long process. Much as evolutionary biologists have often remarked that the preeminence of humankind it may be attributable in no small part to the fact that we have a very slow maturity. It gives us a chance to learn a lot over time. The problem is that if AI overlaps with the tasks, those humble tasks that I was describing before, then employers tend to say, well, gee, why am I hiring people at the entry level? Again, we can already see this in an array of jobs that have been great starting opportunities. Here you're seeing software developers and data scientists, but we actually see this across the knowledge economy where employers are making a marked change in preference toward people with more experience and hiring much smaller share of their hiring is taking place at the entry level. That has significant implications both for educators. How do we help students start their careers not at the beginning but in the middle? How do we prepare them to do at 22 or 23 years old what they used to do when they were 27 or 28, when we already struggle to make effective connections with the world of work? And it also has significant implications for employers because as their organizations have always been shaped around hiring lots of people at the entry level and then through a process of attrition and culling, eventually to fill the ranks of experts. Now you have a lot of demand for people who have some level of expertise, but not a lot of ways for people to acquire it. This creates significant, and I might say almost existential challenges for educators. Before we move on from AI itself, I would be remiss if I didn't offer a few words of encouragement here. It's easy to fall prey to a lot of the gloom and doom talk that we hear. The reality is there's never been a technology that on the net created less employment. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be significant displacements, but it's worth just considering some historical analogies that help us put this in perspective. First, around ATM machines. You may have heard that Famously, since the advent of ATMs in around 1980 or so, um, there were for the ensuing about 3 decades, there kept being more and more tellers. Well, what was going on? It wasn't an ATM machine or a bankomat, depending on your language, your location. Well, the T is a teller, an automated teller machine. It should have made for fewer tellers. But what the reality is that ATM machines changed the unit economics of banking, made it cheaper to operate a bank branch. And so there wound up being a huge growth in banking. In a lot of fields, there's latent demand that we've only just looked at how to unlock. We haven't even really begun to think about these kinds of questions. Think about data scientists. There's no doubt, I can see it in the Burning Glass Institute's own work, that data scientists become much more efficient when they use generative AI. That's great. But what that means is that actually it becomes a lot more efficient to be able to do analyses. It becomes more cost effective to do analyses. That means there's a lot of analyses that before we wouldn't have done because they would have been too expensive that we can afford to do now. That means ultimately you may hire more data scientists, not fewer. What we also see from historical analog is that a lot of these effects may take a lot longer than we think to bear out, despite today's hyperbole, and they may look very different and in a lot of ways unpredictable. If you were standing at the dawn of the internet in, let's say, the mid 1990s, um, if you were in 1998 amidst the biggest mania since the Dutch tulip craze, the dot-com boom, nonetheless, even if you were an ardent believer in the transformative power of the internet, you wouldn't have foreseen that there would be a whole category of jobs for social media managers. There were 65,000 of them just in the United States alone last year. You wouldn't have foreseen that that would have taken, if you had foreseen it, which you wouldn't have seen that that would have taken 12 or 13 years to bear out. And you certainly wouldn't have predicted that the biggest category of job creation driven by the internet would be for delivery drivers. So a lot of these effects are things that will be harder to predict than we might think. And there may in fact be new sets of jobs that get created. In any case, what we can is very clear is that we're entering into a period of great dynamism. And that dynamism will bear out in skills, and skills will be what prepares our students. A lot of that is not just about technical skills or applied skills, but rather about foundational skills. Um, we can see the sets of jobs that are in fact most data driven, most tech enabled, the sets of jobs that many of us would identify as being the highest value and the best paying jobs in the job market today. When we look at what skills they require, they are far more likely to ask for the sets of skills that we would define as foundational to modern work. They're twice as likely to ask for collaboration skills. They're 3 times more likely to look for creativity skills, twice as likely to ask for research skills, 50% more likely to ask for writing skills or problem-solving skills. That's what makes these jobs much less vulnerable to automation than others. Also, very importantly, when we talk about foundational skills, most of us kind of think about this um, mental image I have in my head of when I talk about things that are foundational, I think about pyramids, like the food pyramid that has carbohydrates at the bottom, but the important stuff, the protein at the top. The reality is that your career works almost exactly opposite to that. What we find is that the further north you go in your career, the more those core foundational skills, the kinds of skills that are bedrock to a liberal arts education, for example, the more valuable they become over time. Now, importantly, when we think about foundational skills, we tend to think of it in pretty narrow terms. The kinds of skills that you might see in blue at the bottom of the chart on the left. Collaboration skills and critical thinking skills and creativity skills and writing skills and the like. But when we looked across the highest value jobs in the modern economy, we said, what are the skills that are transversal to all of them? We found, in fact, that there were as well a set of data skills, digital skills, and even business skills that almost every graduate needs to have. To take the example of business skills, that may sound like a suspect claim, but think about something like project management skills. Whether you're going into tech, whether you're a nurse who's coordinating care across different providers, these are sets of skills that you need to have. And yet we don't necessarily think about embedding all of these skills into curricula today. This aligns with work that my colleague, the Harvard Project on the Workforce, David Deming, has found using burning glass data. He found that the jobs that mix what he calls social skills, often communication skills, writing skills, others, with math skills, which again, shorthand for not only math, but a broad array of STEM skills, are the ones that are growing fastest, pay the most, and offer the greatest opportunities for upward mobility over time. And so all of this says that notwithstanding that foundational skills are so important, it would be a mistake to say, okay, well, we do that pretty well already in higher education today. We do that pretty well in primary and secondary education today, so we're all set. The reality is that we need to be thinking about a broader mix, and we need to be thinking about doing them better. We did a survey of educators, about 1,000 educators with ASA. We found that depending on which set of these skills, most educators recognize that they're important, but many fewer educators feel their schools teach them well. And yet, many of these skills are going to become increasingly important. So again, as we help students to be able to navigate a more and more challenging career launch in the world of AI, given the dynamics that we described before, we need to be able to not only navigate those new challenges, but we need to do better at what we're already struggling with today. When we think about building skills, we need to make sure that we're not being too myopic about it. Yes, we need to make sure that students launch well, and a growing amount of our research says that students who don't launch well struggle to ever make it up the ladder. So the whole thing about, hey, we're not training students for the first job, their 20th job, turns out you don't get a good 20th job if you don't have a good first job. But nonetheless, we should recognize that the skills that enable people to open the door aren't necessarily the sets of skills that help people to keep moving up. Here's looking at foundational skills and which ones are most prevalent at the entry level, the mid level, and the senior level. And as you can see, the further north you go in your career, not only, as we said before, the more that those foundational skills become important, but what we also see is that the more important foundational, we find that it is not, that the skills themselves are indeed more important, more strategic sets of skills. It turns out that in every degree program, there are certain sets of skills that that put students ahead, that help them stand out, that give them a leg up relative to peers, that help them land jobs more effectively, that help them get paid better. Take the example of an arts major who learns strategic planning skills. They wind up getting paid 20% more. They wind up with many more opportunities available to them. This is the difference between manning the front desk at a nonprofit and actually doing important planning work. The same is true of math majors who learn risk management skills. The list goes on. We need to understand what those skills are in each discipline. What are the skills that set students at an advantage? And we need to figure out how to integrate them in where possible, and how to signpost for students that they need to find other ways to accrue them where it's not consistent with the rest of the academic program. But at the same time, one of the things that also challenges today is to figure out ways to help students not just landing into jobs, but in moving up over time. This is a analysis that we did actually of retail workers. So it may seem pretty far from the world of higher education, but I think the analogy still stands. We looked at where they were over the course of 5 years. We found a non-trivial percentage Wasn't a huge percentage, but a non-trivial percentage who had progressed into tech jobs. First thought, okay, well, they must be students who are working their way through university while taking a retail job. More often, what we found was these were people rather who were selling computer electronics, for example, and then moving to setting up computer electronics, to taking proper help desk jobs, to moving into networking jobs. Most people don't make big transitions. They move step by step. The average person will have about 12 to 13 career transitions over their career, and that's today. That may be speeding up. Each of those transitions is an opportunity for people to move up or to get stuck. And so what that says is that there is a broader transition that we need to affect in the world of learning, in the world of AI. And that's, as my friend Mitchell Stevens at Stanford likes to call, a transition from a schooled society, one where learning is the exclusive prerogative of the young, to a learning society where we recognize learning, we provide opportunities for learning to happen across the career life course at each transition, and where we provide a way of recognizing and credentialing that learning and signaling that learning so that people can advance step by step and be able to develop their own human capital in highly dynamic markets. What can we do today? Well, first, we need to make sure that what's going on in the market is transparent. That means building an observatory for tracking real-time labor market changes, something the Burning Glass Institute is working on today in partnership with others. It means that we need to not just make that a theoretical set of tools, but things that are available to students. We recently looked at the transitions of school leavers, that is, people who go straight from high school, as we call it in the U.S., to work without going to university. We found that many of them do quite well. In fact, the top 20% out-earn university graduates when you follow them over the course of 20 years. The problem, we also found that there are many starting jobs that tee people up for success. The problem was that it was often very difficult to tell good starting jobs apart from bad starting jobs. The sets of jobs that make people 4 times more likely to be top earners don't always necessarily pay better than the sets of jobs that make people 4 times more likely by the time they're 40 to wind up in poverty. That says that we need to be much better at how we guide students and what kind of information is available to them. We also find through a lot of our research that one of the things that is the most determinative of how effective, of how strong people's career outcomes are, is whether they have an opportunity at work-based learning. What would it look like for us to guarantee every student a work-based learning experience? And then we also think about how do we let people signal that they've acquired the skills that will enable them to keep moving up. Think about how we move in each of those transitions. We build on the skills we've already built, we've already accrued, and then we signal somehow that we're ready to either acquire other skills or that we've already acquired skills that our background wouldn't have suggested. Well, here's a problem. With that motivation, there's been an explosion, a Cambrian moment, if you will, in the number of non-degree credentials that are out there. The Credential Engine Project has a partial tally of 1.1 million credentials. Burning Glass Institute, we recently did an empirical analysis, tracking the careers of about 10 million people to see who had earned a credential, to see how did earning that credential change the slope of their career. Remember that thing from algebra class, y equals mx plus b? Your career has a slope, and earning a credential is supposed to change the slope of the line. The problem is that 2/3 of the time, a credential produces no value. It doesn't help you enter a new career. It doesn't help you move up in your existing career, and it doesn't help you earn more. So that means, on the one hand, the glass is 2/3 empty. Most credentials do nothing to help people advance. On the other hand, we can say the glass is 1/3 full. We analyzed 23,000 different credentials. It's not 1 million, but it's pretty much every credential of significant value, of significant currency. And we found, of course, about 8,000 credentials that provided really meaningful value. In a lot of cases, that wasn't just about brands. Sometimes very reputable brands had credentials that indeed provided a lot of value, and many other credentials that didn't move the needle for learners. And so this says that we need to get a lot more specific about what are the credentials that are in demand, but also which credentials work. Ultimately, what we have an opportunity to do today, if we can fix a talent development system at the primary level, the secondary level, at higher education, and by extending the scope of higher education to serve a broader community of learners across their life course, we have an opportunity to do something that may sound fairly uninspiring, and that's to build people's productivity. You know, when we talk about productivity, many times people flinch. You think about Frederick Taylor and people with white lab coats and clipboards and stopwatches who are mm, looking at how we can get people to do more with less, or how we can make do with lower cost labor. Essentially, the problem with our whole calculus of productivity is that it's based on the denominator of a ratio. You know, productivity is a ratio. It's the ratio of the value of work product to the cost of that work product. Essentially, every time we talk about productivity, every time we try to improve productivity, we focus on the denominator, how to make people's work cost less, how to use less work, how to automate work away, how to make people do more with less, how to use lower cost labor. And perhaps that's why productivity has been stuck. We almost never think about how to build the value of the numerator, how to make people's work worth more. The opportunity today, as AI begins a series of transformations that will be long running, that will play out over time and be far more profound than perhaps we're thinking about today. The opportunity is by investing in the how of education, by changing, by changing what we teach, not just how we teach. We have an opportunity to make people's work worth more, to make people's value in themselves grow as they both start their careers and as they continue over time. Grace, I'm going to turn over to you. I'm looking forward to talking more and to answering any questions people may have.
That's lovely. Thank you. What I might do, there we go. So we can see, I'm just going to add a pin so that you and I will be side by side to have a conversation. Thank you, Matt. That was very inspiring. So many of your comments and statements really resonated with me. And the one that I truly loved was where you mentioned about the value of the degree of the program is not just in that, but in all of the skills acquired along the way and then what we can do and where that value is. There are so many questions in the chat. I'm going to do my best to go through them and address all of the ones that have been raised. One of the questions from Elizabeth is, with such a volatile skill landscape, what should educators prioritize? In your opinion, is it better, smarter to teach durable core competencies or give students hands-on exposure to fast-changing tools, even if that tool is going to be obsolete in 2 years?
So I think this is a both and more than an either or. I know that's a frustrating answer because the time that we have with students is limited, and so inherently we're making choices. But I want to emphasize that, you know, perhaps a way of thinking about this um, is to think about the distinction between timely and timeless skills, and to think less about which we prioritize than when we prioritize them. It's going to be absolutely important for students to have a very strong foundation of timeless skills, the kinds of skills that will help them launch and help them reinvent themselves over time, pivot as the market changes. At the same time, we also know that in order to launch effectively, and particularly as employers are asking them to start their careers in the middle, to outcompete AI, they're going to need to have higher levels of proficiency in some of the sets of capabilities that will allow them to be valuable. We can say, well, gee, why aren't employers willing to train and bemoan the fact that employers are investing less in training starting employees today. But the reality is, we also know that starting workers tend to not stick around very long themselves, and so that's created a dynamic where it's not necessarily reasonable to expect employers to be able to get a return on their investment in training. That says that puts more on us as educators to make sure that we're building higher level of proficiency in the timely skills. But we should realize, to Elizabeth's point, that those skills change fast, right? So you want to build a core frame before you start to build out the timely skills that will change, will become a little bit less relevant as an age out as people approach the market.
Thank you. Carolyn wants to know, do we tend to focus too much on individual skills versus collaborative and co-creative skills, collective abilities that emerge when a group of diverse people work together? No one works in a vacuum. AI might act more like another collaborator, perhaps?
So, collaboration skills are indeed one of the most important sets of skills. I think I may have shared some data before about how much value they have in people's careers, how prominently they figure in high value work, and how much more relevance they have even as people move up in their careers. That said, let's not confuse collaboration, which describes how we interact with others, with the ability to actually work ourselves. So we have to actually have the ability to work at substance. Collaboration skills describe a format as much as they describe a nature of output in and of itself. We need to be able to both be excellent at delivering great output, and we need to get to that output in collaboration. AI can, in fact, serve as another team member with a specific set of capabilities with whom we can collaborate.
As coding becomes accessible to all by AI, how do we guard against a flood of technically correct but conceptually weak code?
Well, I think that's exactly the point here. We tend to emphasize and to think about coding as the ability to generate blocks of code. And that's why it's tempting to look at AI and say, okay, well, look, AI generates blocks of code, what seems very competently. Um, the reality is that when we think about coding as a logic and the ability to express algorithmically a set of essentially business objectives to play out all the different logical dimensions of those objectives. That's something which is much harder for AI to replicate. Our ability to code, therefore, is really about being able to master that kind of logic, that computational thinking. And that's also what will enable us to be um, better connoisseurs of good code in a way. Is it obvious in looking at a block of code what it does? Is it so tangled up that it's hard for us to be able to evaluate whether it's meeting its objectives short of just running it? Those are the kinds of things that we need to make sure that students are learning.
Okay. Amis wants to know what skills should we prioritize in the curriculum as we're teaching?
So I will bring together a couple of concepts that we touched on before. One is the notion of an expanded set of foundational skills. So this is again not only core human skills, but also data skills, digital skills, and a set of business skills. So we can look at these today. We can say what are the skills that drive entry into high value work. Two is a set of applied skills that will require greater levels of proficiency than today, as we see employer preferences shift toward expertise. Three is a set of skills which are essentially which will become generalist skills. These are things like coding skills and the like. And when we put these, and then four is those force multipliers, those power skills of the AI era, those sets of things that get both automated and augmented. Some of those four sets of skills overlap with one another. They're not mutually exclusive sets. But I think those are four frameworks for helping make sure that we identify the sets of skills that every student's going to need.
Okay. Anne wants to know if you've published your work on the credentials of value. She would like to see more, and other people have commented on hers with
Yeah.
lots of thumbs up.
Absolutely. So probably the best way to view that is to view credentialvalueindex.org. And that has both some research papers, a paper that co-published with Mark Schneider at the American Enterprise Institute, but also our Career Value Index Navigator, which actually presents the outcomes-based analytics of those 23,000 credentials and allows you to explore which ones help people enter careers, which ones help people move up effectively, and which ones help people earn more.
Okay. David wants to know, or what he comments, is that on one hand, we talk about that students should learn to be generalists. On the other hand, we talk about how important it is to specialize. How do we communicate those conflicting messages to students and curriculum administrators?
So I think this is one of the best ways to communicate this is to really make sure that there's transparency to students, but also very much to faculty about what are the market's expectations for what are employer expectations and the kinds of careers that students are likely to land into. Um, this is work that we've done with a number of universities where we, could simply say, look, for each department, each program of study, what are the careers that students empirically are going into, not theoretically, but where do they actually land? What are the skills that employers ask for them to have? In which skills are differentiating? Which of those are the fastest growing? Which ones get them better paid? Which ones unlock jobs? Um, Ultimately, that's great fodder for faculty discussion. Faculty are going to be most expert at being able to craft curricula for their courses. But right now, we're asking them to do that in the dark. They don't have good sources of market intelligence. So the same kind of data that can empower students to make more effective decisions are also the data that can help faculty achieve a better balance between building in the core foundations and also making sure that they know which kinds of applied skills will help students enter into the world of work and move up over time.
Oh, that lovely. Now I'm going to turn to Huva. Sorry, I've got it up on a number screen. We've got a number of questions. What are some of the new jobs that AI will create, and what jobs might we lose? And how does higher education respond quickly enough to this shift in employment needs?
So I wouldn't be brazen enough to be able to predict specific sets of jobs. I can tell you for one thing, it won't be a prompt engineer any more than the internet created jobs for Google searchers. But What I can do is share some of the thinking, some of the that we've been developing and we'll be publishing soon on where there may be categories of jobs that are likely to emerge. We talked, for example, before about the jobs that will be created through latent demand that gets unlocked through AI as certain jobs become more efficient. We know there are jobs, again, like those social media managers, which are directly involved in technology. We know there are sets of in that are enabled by AI. We know there's sets of jobs that happen based on the wealth effects. We know that new technologies tend to make the rich richer, and richer people spend more money, and so you can imagine a set of jobs that get created through that sort of mechanism. So there's a whole set of these dimensions which are useful to think through, and they can help us to get some clues as to where some of the big job categories, some of the big categories of job creation will be.
Thank you. Um, Last question, because we could keep going for hours. It seems exhausting and maybe unrealistic to revise full degree programs every few years to keep up with the job market. Are there structural shifts that can make higher ed more adaptive while not burning out faculty?
So I think this is one of the things. I'm glad that you said the word structural. I think this is one of these things where our current mechanisms for alignment are so lagging, often tied, for example, to accreditation reviews, which may happen only every several years, that we tend to wind up having to overcorrect or not correct at all. Okay, well, gee, the field has changed a lot over the last 10 years. Gosh, we're going to have to revise our curriculum a whole bunch. The universities that are doing this the best today are ones that have developed the capabilities to track the market in a more real-time way. That means that the changes that they're making are actually much smaller. So it's actually in some ways the reverse of what the questioner may be thinking. This is less about, hey, if we're constantly monitoring the market, we're constantly changing, it's going to be really hard. We may in fact be changing more often. We may be rethinking curriculum on a recurring basis, but it means that our opportunities to align are more seamless. The changes themselves are smaller and more achievable.
Thank you. And I think on that note, we'll end. Thank you very much, Matt. It's been a very highly engaging keynote from you. An excellent way for our last keynote. George knew what he was doing when he scheduled you in. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. We still have a couple of more sessions coming up, early career researchers and assessment with AI. Thank you. Join me all in thanking Matt for his wonderful presentation today.